So this question here is all about building an algebra to work with formulae and quadratics. Now this one here is all based on a scenario and an application about building a cuboid with dimensions that are there, but we don't know the dimensions specifically in terms of numerical values. We're told them in terms of the variable x. It's going to be our job to somehow be given conditions involving the volume in this case, and be able to then use that to construct an equation, solve it, and determine the length based upon that. So the first part of this is it wants me to show that 2x squared plus 14x minus 45 equals 0, and then calculate the breadth of the storage unit, giving your answer correct to 1 decimal place. Now the first one, we have to look at what information we've got in the question. So we've got the dimensions of the cuboid. Great. How does that help me though? Well, if I look at the next part of the question here, I'm told the volume of the unit is 45 cubic meters. Now I know it's a cuboid, so I know for a cuboid, the volume is length times breadth times height. So if I look at part A, if I know the volume is length times breadth times height, that means my volume, which is 45, is going to be the length of this cuboid times the breadth of the cuboid times the height of the cuboid. So it's going to be the length, x plus 7, times the breadth, which is x, times the height, which is 2. If I then take that and start manipulating it, what I'm going to do is actually swap both sides around as well, just so I've got all my x's on the left and make it neat. Equals 45 like that. If you don't swap them around at this stage, don't worry about it. No issue with that at all. I just prefer having the x's on the left. If I expand that bracket, what I get is I get 2x squared plus 14x equals 45. Now if I go back to the original equation at once, it wants me to show 2x squared plus 14x minus 45 equals 0. Well, if I shift the 45 over to the left, I get 2x squared plus 14x minus 45 equals 0. Lo and behold, I've shown exactly what it wants. I've got to the answer that I'm after. Great. I'm happy with that. Now I want to calculate B, the breadth of the storage unit. So I basically need to solve this for x. Now you're looking at that and you're thinking to yourself, right, that's a quadratic equal to 0. Quadratic equal to 0, I have to factorize it and solve it. So essentially I'm looking for something that will factorize this. However, these numbers are much more complex and the question states give your answer to correct to 1 decimal place. If you ever have a quadratics question, it wants you to solve it and it wants you to give your answer to 1, 2 or more decimal places. Your brain needs to instantly go to the quadratic formula. Now, bonus to the quadratic formula is it's in the formula list, just in case you forget it. Quadratic formula states that x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now for this, the a, the b and the c all come from the coefficients of the quadratic, come from the coefficient of the x squared, the x, and then the constant at the end, respectively. So what I do is I take these values, plug them into this formula, and then I'll get 2 answers. And we know we get 2 because of the plus minus part in there. So if I plug those numbers in, I'll get x is equal to negative 14 plus or minus the square root of 14 squared, take away 4 times 2 times the c, which is negative 45. That's then going to be all over 2 times 2. Now if I sort what's under the square root first, I'll get x is equal to negative 14 plus or minus the square root of 556 all divided by 4. What I now do is I can split this off and get 2 solutions. So I can split it off and get one solution when I do x is equal to negative 14 plus the square root of 556 divided by 4. And I get another solution when x is equal to negative 14 minus the square root of 556 over 4. Now if I solve both of those, the first one will give me x equals 2.394, and then it continues on. And the second one will give me x is equal to 9.394, and then it continues on again as well. Now, if I look at both of these solutions here, and I do a bit of thinking, that second solution, x is equal to negative 9.394. Remember, x is a length. I can't have a negative length. So quadratics, unless it's got a repeated root, we will get two real distinct roots if we're able to solve it using the quadratic formula. Now, this is the case here that we get a negative answer for it. And because it's negative, it's telling me I've got a negative length, but that doesn't make sense. We can't have a negative length. You can't tell someone you're negative 185 centimeters tall. Just like I can't say the breadth of this is negative 9.394 meters. So all that means is I can disregard that solution there, which means I'm left with the second solution that I've got here, and I want to round it to 1 decimal place as it asks me to. I'm going to say that x is equal to 2.4 meters. So I'm going to get my answer from that. So you might initially think, well, quadratics tend to give me two answers, but we managed to disregard one of them just using a bit of logic. Now this question here is a fairly standard question that comes up. Quite a lot of times you'll get this, particularly the quadratic formula part of it. Sometimes you'll see a quadratic formula question that will simply state, solve quadratic equal to 0, giving your answer correct to 1 decimal place. Quite often you'll see it just put like that. Sometimes you'll see it put in a scenario like this and asked to be some sort of an application style question. But it doesn't change the technique. As soon as you see the 1 decimal place part, quadratic formula. Get your bits for your quadratic formula, stick them in, solve it from there, and get your answers. And then a scenario like this, interpret your answers. So I got rid of the negative and I kept the positive one here. So this question here, part A is worth 2 marks. The first of which comes in here, where we've set up our equation, the 45 equals the x plus 7 times x times 2. And then your second mark comes here as you work it through. If you jump straight from this part right to there, you won't get anything. You can't do that. We have to show the steps. So we have to show expanding the brackets and then moving the 45 across. Bear that in mind. You have to show those. Then for part B, we get 1 mark for recognising the quadratic formula and just putting the numbers in. You get your second mark for simplifying the square root and getting 556. You then get your third mark for both solutions, and then your fourth mark is for getting the correct solution and disregarding the negative, using our logic to get rid of the one that we know makes absolutely no sense and does not work. So there you go, 6 marks in total for this one. If it's just a standard quadratic formula question on its own, it'll be worth the 4 marks. Those extra 2 come in from that bit at the start. Another little point to note is that for part A, if you have a brain fart and you forget how to do it, or you think to yourself, this is quite tricky, I can't do it, jump into part B and solve part B first. Come back to part A later on, when you've maybe refreshed your memory a little bit, or you've had a chance to think. It's worth 2 marks, but there's no point in possibly costing yourself all 6 by struggling with part A and taking up mountains and mountains of time. So here's a bit of advice for you. Bear that in mind when you're answering this question. Think of the techniques, think of the formula. Again, it's in the formula list at the start, so bear that in mind. Think of the steps as to how we solve it, and let's look for answers and use a bit of logic to eliminate anything we need to. If you can break it down, if you can take your time, if you can remember the steps in the formula, you'll manage these types of questions, and ultimately you'll see, hopefully, it's easy peasy lemon squeezy.